In 2018, Team Starkid saw massive success with The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, one of their most popular and accessible shows to date. But I already made a video about that one. On March 1st, 2020, Team Starkid released the sequel, Black Friday, on YouTube, and I stayed up past midnight that night to watch it as soon as it premiered because I couldn't travel across multiple states to see it live and I didn't feel like buying the digital ticket to see it prior. The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals was actually the very first Starkid show I watched, so I was very excited to see what they would do with the sequel, and I loved every second of it. I've rewatched it several times since, and to be honest, I still love it, but do I like it more than The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals? Well,
that's a complicated question.
Black Friday is one of Team Starkid's most ambitious plays to date, boasting more songs than most other Starkid shows, larger set design including an entire balcony that they do some pretty creative stuff with, close-up shots filmed separately from the live shows to give the pro shot more depth, multiple intertwining stories all relating to the show's central theme, and the result is the second best critique of capitalism I've seen in a musical. I do have a handful of minor issues with the show that keep it from dethroning The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, as well as some of my other favorite Starkid shows, but they don't keep it from being a great time overall. This video is going to be mostly positive, so let's not waste any time and dive straight into the show. Black Friday's story has 4 central plots, all relating to a certain theme.
See if you Grey Bulls can guess the theme by the end of the episode.
It's capitalism. Black Friday is, at its core, a critique of the massive rise of consumerism that comes at this time of year, and all the main storylines tie into that in some significant way. We see this starting to take root from the very beginning of the show, as it opens with a commercial jingle telling us all about the Tickleby Wiggly, a hot new toy coming out for $49.95. This number does a really great job setting the stage for the rest of the play. It isn't consistent with the tone for the rest of the show, but that's exactly the point. It's a cheery, catchy, in-universe commercial written to generate hype for the toy and get people believing they need to rush out and buy one on Black Friday, a practice in commercial writing that's all too common for the holidays. And if you know about the choice that this toy brings later, you know exactly why that's important. Paul even alludes to this after the commercial's over, and oh my god, Paul's here. The play uses Paul and Emma, 2 of the main characters from The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, to introduce us to Black Friday's actual first protagonist, Tom Houston. Now, I didn't go into detail about Emma's backstory in the previous Starkid video, but it's important for context here, so TLDR, her sister died in a car crash and she decided it was time to get her life together. This is important because Emma's sister, Jane, happens to also be Tom's wife. Now, the connection between Tom and their son, Tim, is fractured by that shared trauma as Tom is trying really hard to make up for what happened. I have a lot to say about Tom. He's an excellent character, but I'm gonna save it for later because I want to use this opening segment to give an outline of our characters and how they tie into the themes of the show. In terms of Tom, his arc revolves around him trying to make up for the gap in their relationship with material things. Tom's mindset is well-intentioned and very focused, but it isn't focused on the right thing. Our second protagonist is Lex Foster, a former student of Tom Houston's who dropped out of school and got a job at Toy Zone to support her deadbeat mother and her younger sister Hannah. However, she has plans to steal one of the Wiggly dolls straight from the store's stock so she can sell it and use the money to take her sister away from Hatchetfield and give her a better life. So, Lex is a character who's very clearly been dealt a bad hand and is trying to exploit the system to her advantage for the sake of the people she cares about. Then we have our secondary villain, Linda Monroe, a woman who clearly thrives in situations that encourage consumerism because of her wealth. She's used to being pampered and catered to because she could typically just pay people to get what she wants out of them. But it's because of this expectation she has for the way she's treated that she's exploited by the main villain into leading the cult that takes over Lakeside Mall in the second act of the play. And last, we have the
goddamn President of the United States of America
trying to comprehend what's happening in the country and how to stop it. It's hard for me to summarize their deal without just telling you everything, so we'll save that for later. So now that I've got an outline for what the show is about, I can go into more... I didn't mention Ethan? Or Becky Barnes? Don't worry. We'll talk about them later. This is where I'm putting down the spoiler warning. Black Friday is a very character-driven show, so the majority of the video from here out is just going to be me breaking the characters down, and I'm going to be talking in a way that assumes you've seen the play to do so. So, if you haven't seen Black Friday, I highly recommend it. I'm going to put the link to the original play in the description since it's on Starkid's YouTube channel. And with that out of the way, we're going to go slightly out of order here and start with the villains. Like the guy who didn't like musicals before it, a huge part of understanding the characters of Black Friday, to me, is understanding how they're manipulated by the villains of the show. But, unlike the guy who didn't like musicals before it, the villains of Black Friday don't exist in a state where I'm able to talk about them as I'm breaking down all the other characters. So I'm gonna open with the villains, and then talk about everybody else. Cool? If you've seen Black Friday, you already know that the main villain of the show is the doll.
The doll?
The Tickle Me Wiggly, or just Wiggly, is an eldritch god, revealed to be one of the Lords of Black in Nightmare Time. But I'm not doing a deep dive into the Hatchetfield lore right now. Within the show, Black Friday, Wiggly on his own operates in two major ways. Most prominently is through the dolls.
The dolls.
At a few points throughout Black Friday, we see Wiggly speaking directly to certain characters who are holding the doll, and in several scenes we see how its presence alone seems to drive people into madness, whether it be through the creation of crazed worshippers or the corruption of other characters possessing them into doing things they normally wouldn't. It's because of that and the design of the Wiggly dolls that I believe Wiggly is inspired directly by Cthulhu, who's been said to drive people mad and create cults surrounding himself in a similar way. But the second, and slightly more understated way that Wiggly gets to the masses is through marketing. The commercial at the beginning is excellent foreshadowing for this, like I mentioned. What better way to start the show than by introducing the audience to Wiggly the very same way that the citizens of Hatchetfield were probably introduced to him? Wiggly wouldn't be half the threat he was if it wasn't for shopper mania, taking advantage of the rampant consumerism that exists at this time of year by debuting on the biggest shopping day of the year with a massive marketing campaign getting the word out about the hot new toy, effectively luring everybody to places where the doll will be so as to more easily manipulate them and build his army of followers. Wiggly also has two major characters acting for him throughout the musical. First, the character I have significantly less to say about, Uncle Wily. He's implied to be a former member of PEIP, we call it PEIP, who went insane after stepping into the black and white and coming face to face with Wiggly. Wily mostly acts as a mouthpiece / envoy for Wiggly. We see him at the very front of the ads for the toy, he hand delivers the Wiggly dolls to Toy Zone on the morning of Black Friday, and he sets the creation of Wiggly's cult into motion by manipulating Linda Monroe. Notice how I'm calling it manipulation instead of something else. The role that Linda Monroe plays in this show shows us exactly what it's critiquing and exactly how Wiggly's manipulation works. Linda Monroe, because of her exorbitant wealth, constantly expects people to treat her a certain way. In her introductory scene, she bribes her way to the front of the line before Toy Zone even opens, and later, when the possibility arrives that she won't be able to get the 4 dolls she wants for her kids, she calls her attorney and threatens to make a legal case against Toy Zone. Then, during the song Feast or Famine, she has the audacity to hold up a Wiggly doll and show it off, as if the people around her aren't rioting and it won't somehow be taken from her. Of course, Linda Monroe acts this way because she's insanely privileged, but much like some of the other characters in the show, she's also here because she's trying to fill a void inside her. It's revealed that she's unfaithful to her husband Gerald, and that, like Tom, she has a tendency to try and buy the affection of her children with toys and presents. When Wily confronts her about this, she says that she just wants to be loved, and for all we know, that is what she wants, but Wily isn't buying it. Linda has a family that loves her already. Well, in theory. But for one reason or another, we could tell that she doesn't see it as enough, because when Wily offers her the opportunity to be adored and worshipped instead, she takes the bait. She jumps at the opportunity to become the leader of a society that looks up to her and acts on her beck and call. But you can make an argument that even here, she's being manipulated. Think about this scene when Linda claims that her god Wiggly has nothing nice to say about Frank Pricely, the owner of Toy Zone. Someone who, like Linda, is in a very comfortable position because of the shopper mania taking place on Black Friday. Wiggly doesn't have anything nice to say about this guy, but that isn't the case for someone like Linda, who's in a very similar position in life, if not a better version of it. That gives me the impression that Wiggly is playing Linda, and she doesn't even realize it. Now that's a turn that would honestly work quite well for the themes of the play. The secondary villain who's so used to getting everything she wants because of her wealth, only being seen as another disposable pawn by the real villain? Well, that's how Wiggly works after all. He promises to fix the holes, but he doesn't. By the way, there's 6 different villain songs in this musical, and they all rock. Starting with Linda's 2 songs, she sings Adore Me, close to the beginning of Act 2. This is the one I have the least to say about, but it's still nothing to sneeze at. Very funny and very catchy. However, Linda's 2nd song is a standout for the whole play for me because of both the vocals and the choreography. It has such a menacing tone to it that's elevated by Lauren Lopez's stellar harmonies with the rest of the cast. What's the song called? Speaking of wiggling, I've already talked about the Wiggly jingle at the very beginning of the play, and you could definitely make an argument that it's a villain song, since it's quite literally made to represent Wiggly as a product. But later in the play, Uncle Wily sings Made in America, and you know it's gonna be a good one when Joey Richter starts pulling out low notes. One step ahead, wagon on fire, you know what I'm here for. Made in America is quite literally the thesis of the show, pointing out how Wiggly's ability to exploit the mass consumerism of the holidays is a product of the American lifestyle that encourages it. But my 2 favorite villain songs of the entire show are back in the first act, and they're not even sung by the main villains. Our Doors Are Open is this incredibly catchy song led by Toy Zone's owner Frank Presley, who's played by one of my favorite Starkids, Corey Doris. I adore the way this song captures the exploitative nature of these businesses during the holidays, and it's probably my favorite Starkid villain song ever. Or at least it was, until Nerdy Prudes Must Die came out.
Wow!
And then, after the song ends, when Frank fails to get the frenzied choppers under control because of his own greed and ego, we're treated to Feast or Famine, another incredibly catchy song that's accompanied by a massive change in tone as all the people who came to Lakeside Mall for a Wiggly begin rioting and Frank is forced to reap the chaos he helped sow. The back-to-back songs of Our Doors Are Open and Feast or Famine create such a perfect lightning-in-a-bottle moment that captures exactly what Black Friday is trying to accomplish with its tones and themes. And on a separate note, I absolutely love how Joey Richter, Lauren Lopez, and Corey Doris all got solos on Black Friday after they didn't sing much at all in The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. Not to mention Dylan Saunders making his return to Starkid here, Black Friday being his first foray in a Starkid musical since Twisted in 2013. So let's talk about his character. Tom Houston is one of Black Friday's 2 main protagonists. He's introduced as Emma's brother-in-law when her and Paul are invited over for a late Thanksgiving celebration. Only Tom is actually going out to the mall to buy his son's Christmas present. He comes off as really bitter in this scene. He's not exactly polite with Emma, despite her being the sister of his deceased wife, and despite his reliance on her to watch Tim for him. And it certainly seems like he doesn't understand Tim as well as he thinks he does. But you can tell there's a huge amount of love for his son driving it all, both because of the way the character is written and because of Dylan Saunders' performance bringing a shocking amount of vulnerability to the table. Tom is written to be shut off from the world, shut off from the people around him, and Dylan manages to pull that off while also making it clear that his emotional state is a wreck, especially so when we get to the first I Want song of the musical. And like What Do You Want, Paul before it, this is a subversion of your typical I Want song, as Tom isn't singing directly about his own wants and desires. He's singing about what Tim wants. Literally, that's the name of the song. What Tim Wants plays with the audience's expectations a bit by appearing as a normal I Want song on the surface. Of course, Tom spends the song focusing on Tim, how the loss of his mother has affected him, and how he wants to get their life and relationship back to a healthy place. Tom even alludes to his own guilt regarding the situation, foreshadowing the reveal later in the show that he was the one driving when they got into the car accident that killed Jane. However, this song is also somewhat deceptive because of its place so early in the musical. Tom sings about the way his shared trauma with Tim has affected them both and how he's going to fix it, but he's singing it in the context of him going to the mall to buy a Wiggly doll. He's acting as if Wiggly will fix the holes that were left in his family from Jane's passing. While on the surface, What Tim Wants is a sad but somewhat hopeful I Want song, it is also a microcosm of the way that Wiggly deceives the characters in the play. By placing this song so early in the show, long before Wiggly's full hand is revealed to the audience, it's able to keep up appearances on the first viewing, but on repeat watches you realize this dude is under Wiggly's influence from the very start. So we know that Tom is under Wiggly's influence here. Why doesn't he break and join Wiggly's cult? Well, aside from him conveniently not being around when the cult is formed, it's a matter of motivation. If I may take focus away from Tom for just a moment, it's stated that Wiggly sowing this chaos is his way of separating his most devout followers from the masses. And who are those followers? Well, you have Linda, who jumped at the idea of being adored by a large group of worshippers, and then below her, you have more people whose motivations only seem to be self-serving. Sherman Young is a creepy toy collector. Gary Goldstein is a lawyer who spends his days serving others in petty legal arguments. You have a man who lost his job when the plant closed, looking for something cheap to bring him joy. The homeless man and the man in a hurry, who are implied to have no real life outside of themselves. Even Charlotte's here, and I already talked about why her life is miserable. Later in the play, Lex refers to Wiggly's cult as a cult of comfort, and she couldn't be more right, because every devout follower of Wiggly's is being offered a chance at happiness for themselves, and only themselves. It's a cult built around the idea that they will be rewarded with a toy that brings them peace and happiness. So to circle back and answer my own question, the reason Tom doesn't fall and join Wiggly's cult, despite being very much under his influence, is because he isn't here for himself. He's here for his son. However, just because he isn't joining the cult doesn't mean he isn't playing right into Wiggly's hand for most of the play. Tom might not be actively aiding the birth of Wiggly, but by being so dead set on getting one of the dolls for his son, he's still doing exactly what Wiggly wants, because Tom ends up being one of the only people who can put a stop to Wiggly's birth. Throughout the show, Tom gets into fights over the doll, he riots, forces himself to keep going after being stabbed, threatens to beat a child to death, and ultimately abandons his old flame Becky Barnes once he gets his hands on a doll. Tom spends the whole play doing stuff he normally wouldn't in pursuit of the idea of what Wiggly is promising him. Wiggly is keeping Tom in a metaphorical sleep for most of the play to keep him from being a threat. This culminates with Tom's second solo song, If I Fail You. When Lex manages to talk some sense into Tom, he grapples with what he's been doing all this time and what he could be doing instead. The time spent in pursuit of products that he believes will make things okay between him and his son, that time could be spent with his son instead, actually talking about their shared trauma and coming out better for it. But Tom is already racked with guilt over what happened to Jane, so much so that he can't stand the thought of making another mistake. He's keeping Tim at an arm's length and hoping to please him or earn his affection with material things because he's terrified of what will happen if he fails to be the father that Tim needs. It seems easier to just try and buy his affection, right? All the hell he went through in Lakeside Mall, rioting, getting stabbed, all of it seems easier to Tom than the idea of failing his son one more time. But Tom can't expect himself to be a perfect father. The pressure that he's putting himself under has only caused him to drift farther and farther away from his son. And the character who opens Tom's eyes to that, she has quite a bit of baggage to unpack as well. Lex Foster is a character who has no positive adult influence in her life. Her last name even alludes to this, pointing out that she might as well be a foster child. She's working as a stock girl at Toy Zone where she's emotionally abused by her boss, and we learn very quickly in the song Califor MIA, or California if you're in a hurry,
I'm in a hurry!
That her mother might as well be an absentee in the family as she spends all her time drinking while Lex is the one who has to support her habits as well as her younger sister Hannah. In the very first scene that she's in, it's revealed to us that she used to be a student of Tom's, who was a high school shop teacher before Jane's passing. However, after Tom quit, Lex subsequently flunked and dropped out, so even if Tom had a positive influence on her life at one point, that clearly isn't the case anymore. And despite all of this damage, Lex isn't coerced by Wiggly or even driven insane by Wiggly's presence like many other characters are. She steals one of the dolls with the intention of selling it so she could get out of Hatchetfield and move to California with Hannah and her boyfriend Ethan. And these actions aren't motivated by Wiggly's influence at all. In fact, they're the exact opposite of what Wiggly wants, because if Lex's plans succeeded, then there would be no Wiggly doll in Lakeside Mall to be used for his birth. Lex doesn't fall for the cult of comfort ideology that Wiggly uses to manipulate so many other people in Hatchetfield, and there's a couple of very good reasons for this. Lex was forced to grow up faster than anybody should, finding no success in education and having to join the workforce full-time at 16 to support her family. Lex was never given the tools she needed to succeed in a system that clearly doesn't care about people in her situation. What little we see of Lex's relationship with Frank Presley is emblematic of this. Frank obviously doesn't think very highly of Lex, but he's using her for labor anyway. She's treated as disposable, even though her work is needed to help Toy Zone function and to help Frank get the profits that he craves.
Nobody gives a care about the fate of labor as long as they can get their instant gratification.
Lex is being exploited by a system that sees her as less, despite what her labor contributes to it. But Lex understands that she's being exploited because she was forced to exist within this system much faster than most people are expected to. That's only part of her motivation though. It's not just the desire to make her own life better, but the desire to make her sister's life better. Lex's solo, Black Friday, the song not the play, is one of my favorite Starkid songs lyrically. There's a lot that could be unpacked here, but we don't have time. What I want to focus on right now is this sequence closer to the end of the song, where Lex speaks about her relationship to Hannah. It seemingly started with confusion, with Lex not knowing what her younger sister really means to her. Of course, there's some level of comfort they can give each other as family, and Lex can identify with Hannah because she's being born into the same situation that Lex was. But Lex has the opportunity to give her sister something that she never had. An adult that can influence her life in a positive way. But it's not exactly easy to do that in Hatchetfield, living the way they're currently living. Ethan even alludes to this when he's talking to Hannah one-on-one during the first act. They're not doing all of this for themselves, they're doing it so Hannah can be someone with a better life than what was handed to them. When Lex says in this song that she needs Hannah more than Hannah needs Lex, she's saying this because Hannah is Lex's reason for wanting more out of life. She wants to build a new future for herself and for Ethan, of course, but the most important piece of the puzzle here is Hannah, who Lex spends the entire second act worrying about as she's taken captive by Wiggly's cult. This is why Lex understands Tom well enough to talk some sense into him during the last act of the show. She knows what it's like trying to be a good role model for a kid, trying to provide them with a life of happiness, but she also understands how people like Tom are exploited because she's seen it firsthand by working at Toy Zone. Lex is the yin to Tom's yang. While Tom is being exploited by the system because of his desire to give his son a better life, Lex originally sought to exploit the system herself to give her sister a better life. Their stories are a direct parallel of each other, right down to both stories featuring characters who I feel are criminally underutilized.
We get it, Ethan, you're a good speller.
Ethan is Lex's boyfriend and an implied father figure for Hannah.
That's it?
Ethan doesn't do much and doesn't have a whole lot of screen time in Black Friday. I know he shows up in Nightmare Time, but we're focusing on Black Friday today, I'm sorry. Ethan is a very likable character for what little attention he's given in the play. He has a very solid, playful chemistry with Lex. It's obvious that they're cut from the same cloth and found solidarity with each other. And the two scenes where Ethan comforts Hannah about her fears are very heartwarming. But then he just kinda dies towards the end of Act 1, and then we don't hear from him for the rest of the play. Not really. There's this scene where some version of Ethan talks to Hannah from the black and white, but it's obviously not the real Ethan. Whether you see him as a bad double or just a corrupted version of himself, either way, this scene says more about the black and white than it does about Ethan as a character. And to add insult to injury, he isn't mourned or even mentioned by any of the characters after that scene. At least not by name.
Yeah, me and Ethan wanted a doll to sell.
To be frank, and I don't like saying this because I still think Ethan is a good character, but it makes Ethan feel like he was written into the show just to be killed off. For him to be established as this cool, likable guy in the first act, only for him to be axed just as quickly, with barely any mention of it after the fact, no visible impact on the characters that were close to him, it would not be that difficult to write Ethan out of this story, and I think that's a shame because there's so much you could have done with him if you kept him alive. I mean, everybody dies at the end anyway.
This is Hatchetfield!
Could you imagine if Ethan had gotten more involved in Tom's story instead? They imply that Tom knows who Ethan is, so why not elaborate on that? Just imagine the tension you could create by having the two of them in one scene. You have Tom risking life and limb to get a Wiggly doll for his son, while Ethan is fully aware that Hannah has a Wiggly in her backpack. Sounds good on paper, right? Only problem is you would have to write around the presence of a certain other character in Tom's story, a character that I believe holds more significance.
Becky Barnes!
I remember Becky Barnes being one of the more divisive characters when Black Friday first dropped, to the point where I made this YouTube community poll in preparation for the video to see if things have changed in the years since. Well, for one reason or another, there are significantly more people now who like her than there were before. At least based on this poll, which only has about 200 votes in my vague memory of the Black Friday comment section, which I now realize isn't the most reliable source in the world, so what do I think about her? Well, for starters, I think she's a lot more nuanced than Ethan is. In fact, I would actually say she's the most nuanced character in the show. In terms of motivation, Becky is definitely cut from the same cloth as Tom. She's there for other people as opposed to being there for herself. Not for any specific family member, but for a little girl staying at the hospital she works at. There's a lot more to it than just that though. But before I discuss it further, I feel I need to give a trigger warning, as this section of the video will contain descriptions of physical and emotional abuse. To skip this segment, go to the timestamp on screen. In Becky's introductory scene, she's chastised by Linda Monroe for not being capable of standing up to her ex-husband, Stanley. She specifically recounts Becky using clothing like sunglasses and turtlenecks to cover the marks he left on her, even when what she was wearing didn't match the weather at all. Obviously, Linda's perception of Becky being weak here is heavily flawed, and Linda Monroe is a character who's meant to have a flawed perception of the world anyway. Linda and the rest of Hatchetfield all assume that Stanley ran away and left Becky by herself, but that's not the case. As Becky is helping Tom recover from being stabbed, she confides in Tom about her relationship with Stanley and just how awful he was. It's implied that Stanley was at least a few years older than Becky, as he had his own car, an apartment, and he was capable of buying alcohol for Becky and her friends. Stanley was very controlling of Becky, deciding when she would go out in public and eventually choosing her career for her, which is revealed to be the reason Becky is a nurse. This is on top of the physical abuse that was all but confirmed by Linda Monroe earlier. Then she reveals that one night, when Becky considered going to Jane Houston's funeral, she and Stanley got into a massive fight that led them into the woods, where Becky stabbed Stanley and left him to his presumed death. Becky's introduction has a lot more going on when you go in already knowing the twists that come with her character. Knowing that the assumptions held by Linda and the rest of Hatchetfield are false adds a layer of depth to these scenes that you don't get on a first viewing. And Becky trying to get a Wiggly for the child in the hospital could absolutely be her way of trying to ease her guilt over what happened with Stanley. But I'm also compelled by the way that both Becky and Tom are treated in the song What Do You Say? Not by the writers, but by the ensemble cast singing the song. What Do You Say on the surface is a really funny take on a love song, sung from the perspective of a crowd of onlookers gossiping about two people. But throughout the song, characters spill intimate details about Tom and Becky's personal lives, they voice expectations for how their interactions will play out, and wonder how the both of them are actually feeling about everything. The citizens of Hatchetfield are treating Tom and Becky's relationship like a commodity, like their personal lives are just entertainment, like a TV show that you talk to your friends about, discussing the characters and speculating what's going to happen when the next episode drops. And this speaks directly to the way that Becky herself was treated like a commodity by Stanley, who dictated every aspect of her personal life as if it was his own. Certain lines in What Do You Say make it clear that the citizens of Hatchetfield see Tom and Becky as less desirable because of their statuses and history, and at this point in time, they're being acknowledged not as people, but as items for everyone else's personal enjoyment. It's for these reasons that I think Take Me Back is another excellent addition to the soundtrack. From the very first line, "You look just the same as I always remember." Tom saying this to Becky carries so much more weight than I think people realize. He doesn't see Becky as a stranger, or a commodity, or as a murderer. He looks at Becky, and he sees the same person he fell in love with in high school. Tom and Becky have both undergone their fair share of trauma that's led them both to be caught up in the Black Friday from hell. But for this one moment, they remind each other of a time before all of it. Before the 2 tours in Iraq, before the abuse, before the car crash, before they were wrapped up in trying to fix the holes left in their heavily damaged lives. Unfortunately, this is where most of my positive notes for Becky Barnes end. For as much as I adore the way she's written, and as much as I adore her songs, and as much as I adore Kim Whalen's performance, Take Me Back doesn't really impact Tom and Becky or their motivations in the long run. They get back to searching for a Wiggly doll almost immediately, and when they find one, Tom takes it with no hesitation, leaving Becky to be captured by Linda's cult. Bear in mind, this is the next scene that they're in after Take Me Back. Becky then spends almost the rest of Act 2 passed out, only for her to wake up after Linda's final song to shoot her in the head. And okay, I do love this scene for Becky's character. It brings everything I just talked about full circle by having Becky stand up for herself, proving she's more than the commodity that Linda and the rest of Hatchetfield view her as. But man, they needed something, anything, in between Take Me Back and this moment to give her relationship to Tom more weight. Make Tom more hesitant to leave Becky behind, or show him regretting his actions, at least. I know he's under Wiggly's influence, but with Take Me Back being about both characters remembering a time before they were so concerned with products, you could have used this opportunity to show the beginning of him breaking free. Instead, with the play as it is, Tom's awakening seemingly happens all at once, when Lex talks some sense into him right before If I Fail You, and it makes Tom's arc feel a little bit rushed as a result. And the same can be said of Becky. To an even larger degree, I would argue. She passes out while trying to get the Wiggly doll from Hannah, only to wake up in opposition to Wiggly, not even trying to get the doll after she shoots Linda with no need for coercion whatsoever. This is an excellent moment for her character, but it's completely lacking in build-up outside of the one interaction Becky and Linda have in the first act. But before I move on, I want to preface that these complaints are not the result of either character being badly written. I think the opposite of that. I think the characters themselves are amazing, but to me it feels like they wanted to do a little bit more with them, only they couldn't, because there's one more storyline they had to make room for. My biggest problem with Black Friday, the thing that I think ultimately keeps it from surpassing my favorite Starkid shows in spite of the brilliant character writing on display here, is that it was too ambitious of a story for its own good. And no storyline in Black Friday is more emblematic of this than the story of President Howard Goodman and his peeps. That's a joke, viewer. I'm speaking pretty negatively right now, I know. But the real kicker here is that this storyline isn't even bad. It's actually really good. I love that the president here isn't portrayed as just another greedy rich dude, but instead he's just some guy who doesn't really have any idea what's going on or what he's doing. That is a great representation of how the American government as a whole doesn't really do anything to fix the inherent flaws in its system because of a lack of understanding that usually comes from the people in charge. Kurt Mega's performance sells this perfectly. It's also very nice to see the return and further fleshing out of General John McNamara, who was introduced in The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. So yeah, I don't have any big problems with this storyline. But the thing about Black Friday is that it was carrying the weight of having to cement Hatchetfield as something with the potential to be a series. You could tell they wanted to do more with this setting just by virtue of them making a sequel that was this ambitious to begin with. It was saddled with having to establish the beginning of Hatchetfield's overall lore in an intriguing way, while also telling the more character-focused story it wanted to tell. And for the most part, they did a really good job balancing these two things. But you can tell certain aspects of the story had to be put in the backseat so they could further flesh out this particular plotline, because the rest of the show genuinely would not work without it. This is the storyline that fleshes out Wiggly as more than just a doll. The storyline that establishes him as this fearsome deity with terrifying plans for the world we know. Without this storyline, the rest of the show doesn't make sense because so much of the story hinges on the way that Wiggly manipulates most of the characters in Lakeside Mall. This isn't like The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, where not knowing that
Shut up, Tiffany. Shut up.
Didn't hurt the story at all, because that show was written to stand on its own before Hatchetfield became a whole series.
Do you see him?
Yes, I fucking see him!
I'm not going to start making assumptions about what the writer's room for Black Friday was like. I wasn't there. I don't know any of Team Starkid's writers or actors personally, and I mean nothing but respect for them when I say this. But to me personally, it feels like Black Friday bit off just a little bit more than it could chew. And that's okay, because so did I. This video ended up being way bigger than I anticipated. I started production on this at the beginning of November. I originally wanted to have this out on Black Friday, but I decided to push it back to a December release date for my own sanity. And even now, as I'm recording this voiceover, I don't know if it'll be ready before January. I'm still not used to making video essays on a regular basis, so I'm finding myself getting burnt out pretty easily on larger projects if I don't take my time with them. But I'm glad I did take my time, because as I did, I came to appreciate Black Friday in ways I didn't before. The longer I spent working on this video, the more I grew to love a play that I already loved to begin with. I think the Becky Barnes segment is the most emblematic of that. Going into writing it, I was expecting it to be a lot more negative than it actually came out. So to be clear, I cannot understate how wonderful Black Friday is as a whole. And I don't think any of the handful of negative things I said about it should be a deterrent that keeps you from enjoying it. I fully believe Black Friday deserves to stand just as tall as The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals Before It and Nerdy Prudes Must Die after it, because it is undoubtedly a landmark for Starkid and the Hatchetfield series. Black Friday is the reason Hatchetfield gets to be the first of its kind. A musical multiverse of stories, sparking an anthology series that spans not only stage musicals, but a web series with 2 seasons and now a short film, all utilizing the same settings and many of the same characters in a myriad of new ways. The Nightmare Time series and Nerdy Prudes Must Die have proven that the formula that Black Friday established is something that carries true weight and longevity with it. So to backtrack on what I said at the beginning, I like The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals more as a standalone play, but I would argue that Black Friday is more important to the Hatchetfield series overall because of the sheer ambition it brought to the table, having a clear impact on the series since. The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals opened the door, but Black Friday had to walk through it, and it did so almost flawlessly. So let's end the video on a positive note. I couldn't think of a better song to end Black Friday with than What If Tomorrow Comes. Hannah Foster as a character is the best of both worlds for what Black Friday is trying to accomplish here. She has a direct tie to one of the main protagonists, Lex, of course, which gives her amazing importance to the more character-focused story, but she is also used to establish the bits of lore that Black Friday is setting up, and to great effect. Hannah's connection to the black and white, the continuous implications that she can see through dimensions, the way she foreshadows several of the biggest moments in the show, all of this elevates the final number of the musical and gives it multiple meanings. The repeated line of "What if tomorrow comes" inherently calls into question whether or not it actually will come. The immediate message to be taken away from the song is to treasure the time you have with the people you care about, because you might not know for sure if tomorrow will find you alongside them. But on the other hand, the contradictions within the song draw further attention to Black Friday's repeated implications of there being multiple dimensions. Tomorrow will come, tomorrow won't come, will tomorrow come today? These could absolutely be referring to separate realities where tomorrow brings something completely different. As the song moves on, the stage becomes lined with what I assumed at first were more survivors from Lakeside Mall. But all of the actors present who were in The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals are dressed as characters that they played in that show. Characters like Charlotte, Bill, Ted, and Mr. Davidson, who, if this were a direct sequel to The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals, wouldn't be present in this way because they were all infected and in a hive mind-like state that wouldn't have them frantically searching for a doll that would bring them happiness. Of course, that's assuming that these characters are actually nearby in this reality, in this version of Hatchetfield. I mean, we see Charlotte in the prior scene, so we know that she could very easily be nearby, but as for everyone else, they could just as easily be visions from another reality, seen only by Hannah. The PEIP storyline confirms the existence of multiple universes within Hatchetfield's canon, and Hannah even opens What If Tomorrow Comes by continuing to allude to this, asking everyone if they can see the same things that she does, if they know the same things that she does. What If Tomorrow Comes acts as a perfect closer for Black Friday's story, while also establishing that there's something larger planned for the Hatchetfield series. The universe is infinite, after all. Tomorrow always comes somewhere.
5,
3.
2.
What if tomorrow?
Oh shit, was that a nuke?